right? So like we talked about before, we have these issues with this idea of what I call ambikinetic, right? And using the whole body and all four limbs to do the work, right? And that's what we see with Chris Johnson, who's, you know, again, the fastest people on earth. Whenever they move, their whole body is coordinating all together. And I'm not going to go too deep into this slide, but this is from, you know, a former talk, but this idea, you know, of being ambidextrous throughout your body and being able to use, you know, your limbs equally to create force, right, and absorb force, and using your whole body to absorb force, instead of what we see on the injuries where people only use one joint, or they have a tendency to put more force into one area of the body that becomes this area of vulnerability. You know, even like a hernia, for example, as the core gets weaker, right, and we're overloading those hip flexor, you know, areas, you know, in your groin, the tissue starts to become weak. It becomes an area of vulnerability. You know, you end up with a perforation in the tissue, and then, you know, something pops through. So, you know, the opposite of that is being, you know, efficient and coordinated and sequencing, using both sides of the body to get into these counter rotation, stretch and recoil, and being able to explode. And we also know that, you know, being able to use both hands and both sides of the body, you know, is a huge reader outer issue as you move along in sports. You know, maybe not so much in some sports, but in most sports, you have to be able to use both hands, both legs, and eventually, you know, be able to go to both directions, right or left, you know, for, you know, a simplicity way of saying it. So this Chowdhury link at the bottom here, or excuse me, this reference to this article, you know, we're going to talk about this, and I'll show this picture in a second, but it's the whole idea of basically if I put a football in one hand versus the other, or a lacrosse stick on one side versus the other, it changes the kinematics of the trunk relative to the lower body, and the torques that in the ground reaction forces that happen, you know, through the lower extremities, and particularly the knee, and that varus valgus positioning of the knee as the trunk starts to change based upon where I have, you know, the ball or that implement in my hands. So here you can see that picture, right? And you can see the different angles at the knee, right, that are going on there based upon the positioning of the stick and the arm positions, right? So then we also have the idea, you know, that again, being ambikinetic and using our full body in this 60 to 40 weight shifting, right? So, you know, almost all functional movements are 40 to 60% weight shifting and 40 to 60% rotation. You know, you could also look at weight shifting as being displacement versus rotation. Like if you really kind of throw a really hard punch, it's more than weight shifting. You tend to displace your body actually and move your position in space as you rotate. Right. So in terms of that, you know, that's probably when we look at the 1-inch punch, right, is the most powerful movement that is executed. When we look at the ability, you know, in terms of rate of force production, to go from a static position and boom, and create this, you know, big, powerful movement. On the other opposite end of the spectrum down here, we have limping, right, which is this really uncoordinated motion where we're favoring one side of the body. We're not getting into those, you know, rotation and weight shifting patterns correctly, and we're going all to one side. So, and I also, you know, see this in people, and I see this in myself, especially, you know, after I haven't rested very well or I've overdone it, I get into this fatigue pattern that almost starts to kind of mimic a limp, because you start, I really believe most people have this, coming back to this idea of being ambikinetic, where most people are not ambikinetic, and they have this really dominant side, whether it's their, you know, they're just one arm dominant, or they had an injury in their past, or whatever it is, they tend to favor one side of the body so much. But when they get tired, we see an exacerbation of those bad mechanics as well, like which we talked about with the throwing athletes. We start to see more scapular movement as they get further along with their pitch counts. You start to see more of this abnormal scapular motion going on. Right. And now here's a position, you know, a picture of the positioning of the limb, where the head is going off the center line, right? That head over foot. Now our head is going to the outside, more lateral to the foot, right? Which puts us just in a, you know, it's a competitive disadvantage. There is no advantage to being, you know, that far with our center of gravity away from our base of support. Right. So basically, you know, when we're doing rehabs, or we're looking at, you know, athletes, coming back to this evaluation-based protocol, one of the first things that we want to do is make sure that they have basic normal biomechanics before we start advancing into plyometrics and all of these things. So, that's another thing which we're going to talk about more, that the wobbler is great for our ability to help people self-correct. And, when they have these, again, people come in with old injuries and you think, oh yeah, I'm just going to throw them into doing these running mechanics drills. And then, a month later, they're starting to have issues with tendonitis or whatever, because we didn't fully evaluate the situation. And they had, maybe they had Osgood Schlatter's a few years ago, maybe they, it ended up with patellar tendonitis or something along those lines. And now we are exacerbating it because we didn't fix some of these pathomechanics that they have, right? So, and this is another picture, of the spinal engine, and looking at Hall, this study where this guy was had all four limbs, were missing from his body. I don't know the whole story, if he had amputations or he was born like that. And, ultimately watching him do these motions where he's doing this side bending and twisting, which you can see here, vividly in this picture, he was still able to ambulate, basically on his ischial tuberosities, underneath of his glutes, to create this, spinal engine rotational motion where you're getting this counter rotation between the pelvis and the upper body, right? Steve, did you see that video? Taylor, Noah, have you seen that video?
Which one?
From this guy? You've seen that before?
Yeah. I have not.
Yes, I have a few tabs open.
You gotta unshare.
Oh, right. Yeah, you guys can't see it. That's probably good, because then you'd be able to see how many tabs I have open here. That's right, Noah. Noah's my man, the expert.
I was the technology student for half of my professors during class.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Which is a pretty crazy thing to see. But it also shows, the human resiliency and what we're willing to do to function, right? We got to figure it out. So, what's to note here, right, is look at the counter rotation between the upper body and the lower body, right? This coiling motion that's going on. Steve, would you say that this mimics elite level running?
I would say there's definitely some component of that.
I'm curious what you see there.
Yeah, there's definitely, you have to have the hip rotation to run fast. And the counter rotation, hips to the shoulder axis.
Yeah, and right, and watching this video, you see that opposite motion between the hips and the pelvis as the shoulders are moving. I think what we see here is we see an exaggeration in the upper body going into the coronal plane and rotational more, because he doesn't have any limbs, right? Where typically when you're getting that up and down motion with the arms with this, and as the scapula is retracting, the hips are driving it probably more. So you're not going to see, as much of that rotation of the upper body with it. right? Because I think he has to exaggerate it to get the power that he needs to in this movement. But
Right.
but very similar, right?
And he doesn't really have to move his head because he doesn't have legs.
If you look at it though, I mean, there is a little bit of a shift, right? Considering,
Yeah.
right, considering he doesn't have any legs, there's this slight movement that goes just a little bit more. But you're right. I think if he had legs, you would see a bigger motion. That's a good point, Taylor, right? That if he had the legs, the head would be shifting even more. But because, you know, his base of support is more proximal and the lever arm is shorter, he doesn't have to get as much of that side flexion. Plus, if he did that, he's probably going to be more unstable, right? If he gets more side bending, he's going to fall over, right? That's great.